Winter hadn't just arrived in the Dakota Territory. It had declared war. Outside the buried shelter, the wind screamed at 60 miles per hour, ripping shingles off roofs 3 miles away and freezing exposed skin in under 90 seconds. The thermometer, had anyone been foolish enough to check, read 40 degrees below zero. Snow didn't fall so much as fly sideways, turning the world into a white void where visibility stopped at arm's length. Inside the underground room, 14 people sat crammed, shoulder to shoulder, in a space designed for one. Children slept in their parents' laps. Adults leaned against earthen walls. The air smelled of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and wood smoke, yet nobody complained because they were breathing. Their faces, pale with exhaustion and shock, carried the slack expression of people who'd just escaped death by minutes. The temperature inside held steady at 64 degrees Fahrenheit. A single kerosene lantern cast amber light across the scene. In the corner, a small stone hearth radiated gentle warmth from embers that had burned down an hour ago. The fire itself had been modest twigs, thinner than a child's finger, burning for perhaps 20 minutes. Yet the heat persisted, trapped by tons of prairie soil pressing in from all sides, held and released slowly by river rocks that lined the floor. But 6 months earlier, these same people had placed bets on how quickly the girl would die. The wealthy had given her 4 weeks. The religious had prayed for her soul, while predicting her frozen corpse would be found by November. The educated had explained with charts and manuals why her plan violated every principle of frontier construction. They'd laughed when she started digging. They'd called her insane when she disappeared into the earth. They'd written her obituary in their minds before she'd even finished building. What would you do if everyone around you, your family, your neighbors, even the church, decided you were worthless? Rebecca Clark was 16 when her own stepfather threw her onto the street like garbage. The wealthy bet she'd be dead within a month. The religious said God wouldn't shelter fools, but sometimes the people who cast you out are the ones who'll beg you for mercy when the storm comes. The question hung in the cold Chicago morning air like visible breath, though Rebecca didn't speak it aloud. She stood on the corner of Michigan Avenue and Madison Street her entire life, bundled in a canvas sack at her feet, and watched her stepfather's broad back disappear into the crowd of mourning pedestrians. Gary Young hadn't looked back once, hadn't hesitated, hadn't shown even the decency of doubt. Rebecca was 16 years old, female alone, and had exactly $200 hidden in the hem of her skirt. The money represented 3 years of scrubbing other people's floors. 3 years of waking at 4 in the morning to light fires in parlor stoves before the Hartford family stirred. 3 years of swallowing insults, enduring Mrs. Hartford's cold perfectionism, and saving every spare penny with the discipline of someone who understood that money meant survival and nothing less. $15 per month, 36 months. $540 earned, $360 deducted for room food and the uniforms Mrs. Hartford required her servants to wear. $180 saved, $20 in Christmas tips from guests who'd noticed the quiet girl who refilled their wine glasses without being asked. $200 total. She'd counted it 17 times in the past week, spreading the coins across her narrow servant's bed after the household slept, making sure every penny was accounted for. The counting had become a ritual, a prayer of sorts, proof that she existed, that her labor mattered, that she wasn't the worthless burden Gary Young claimed. The morning had started 3 hours earlier when Rebecca descended to the kitchen to find her canvas sack sitting on the doorstep, contents dumped onto the frost-covered stones. One wool blanket, a knife, spoon, and fork wrapped in cloth, a small cooking pot with a dented bottom, 2 tin plates, 3 books, a volume of poetry, a Bible with her mother's maiden name inscribed on the flyleaf, and her grandfather's journal, its leather cover cracked and soft with age, a kerosene lantern reservoir half full. The message was clear. Gary Young had decided. The decision had been brewing for 2 weeks, ever since Donald Harris made his offer. Harris was 56, a widower, a merchant who'd made his money in grain futures and lost his wife to what the obituary had called an unfortunate fall down the stairs. Rebecca had seen Mrs. Harris at church 6 months before her death, had noticed the careful way she moved the long sleeves in summer, the flinch when her husband touched her shoulder. She'd also noticed the bruises. When Gary Young announced that Rebecca would marry Harris, she'd refused immediately. The refusal had been instinctive, absolute, non-negotiable. She'd rather starve than become the second Mrs. Harris, rather freeze on the street than spend one night under that man's roof. What she hadn't known, what she'd discovered by accident when she overheard Gary and his new wife Lucille arguing 3 days later, was that Donald Harris hadn't just asked for Rebecca's hand. He'd purchased it. $500 paid in advance for the right to marry a girl young enough to be his granddaughter. Gary had already spent $300 of it on gambling debts. The remaining $200 sat in a lockbox in his study insurance against his creditors. By throwing Rebecca out, he avoided having to return the money while simultaneously ridding himself of what he'd called in Lucille's hearing a useless mouth. Rebecca had listened to this exchange from behind the kitchen door, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour earlier. She'd felt something crystallize inside her chest, not quite rage, not quite grief, but a hard clarity that felt like swallowing ice. She understood finally that she'd been merchandise her entire life. First, her father had traded her to Gary through remarriage after he'd died when she was 9. Then her mother's death when Rebecca was 13 had simply finalized the transaction. Now Gary was selling her to the highest bidder and pocketing the profit. The realization should have broken her. Instead, it sharpened her. That night, Rebecca had retrieved the $200 from its hiding place in her mattress seam, transferred it to the hem of her skirt, using careful stitches, and made her plan. She would leave before Gary could force the marriage. She would go west where the government was giving land to anyone brave or desperate enough to claim it. She would build something that belonged only to her, something that couldn't be sold, traded, or taken without her consent. She would survive. Now standing on the Chicago street corner with September morning light turning the city golden, Rebecca picked up her canvas sack and began walking toward Union Station. The westbound train departed at 11. She had 4 hours to purchase her ticket, find a seat, and disappear into the Great Plains where stepfathers and widowers and gambling debts couldn't follow. The journey took 4 days. The train rattled across Illinois, Iowa, and into the Dakota Territory, carrying homesteaders, speculators, and the desperate. Rebecca shared a hard bench with a young woman named Helen Moore, 19 and 7 months pregnant, traveling with a husband who looked simultaneously terrified and determined. Helen's eyes kept drifting to Rebecca's lone canvas sack. Finally, somewhere past the Iowa border, she spoke. Her voice carried genuine concern, not judgment. "Are you traveling alone? That's brave." Rebecca met her gaze without flinching. "Or foolish. I'll find out soon enough." The honesty seemed to surprise Helen, who smiled despite her obvious discomfort. Her husband Roger sat across from them, pretending to read a newspaper while clearly listening. When Rebecca asked where they were headed, Helen explained they'd claimed land near a settlement called Millwood Population. 4712 homesteads scattered across rolling prairie. Roger finally lowered his paper. He studied Rebecca with the assessing look of someone trying to calculate odds. "You got people waiting for you in Millwood, no people. Just land." Rebecca kept her voice neutral, offering no details. Roger exchanged a glance with Helen that Rebecca couldn't quite read. Concern, perhaps, or pity. He folded his newspaper with deliberate precision. "Land office gives you 5 years to prove up. You got plans for shelter before a winter." Rebecca thought of her grandfather's journal, its pages filled with cramped handwriting describing earth houses in Ireland, techniques passed down through generations of people too poor for timber or brick. She thought of her mother's deathbed words, whispered through tuberculosis, ravaged lungs, "The soil protects its children when humans won't. I have plans." Rebecca didn't elaborate. The train deposited them in Millwood on a late September afternoon when the prairie grass rippled like ocean water under a steady wind. The settlement consisted of a general store, a church with a crooked steeple, a land office that doubled as the sheriff's quarters, and scattered homesteads visible as distant structures breaking the horizon line. Rebecca filed her claim at the land office, paying $14 for the paperwork that granted her 10 acres bordering Willow Creek. The clerk, a middle-aged man with ink-stained fingers, studied her with undisguised skepticism. "You understand the terms 5 years continuous residence, cultivation of the land, construction of a dwelling. You fail any of those, you forfeit the claim." "I understand." He stamped her papers with more force than necessary. "Lot of folks come out here with dreams. Most of them end up in graves or on trains back east. Winter in the Dakota Territory isn't like Chicago winter. This cold doesn't care how tough you think you are." Rebecca folded her claim papers into her coat pocket. "Then I'll learn to care more than it does." She walked to her plot that same afternoon, following the clerk's directions along a rutted path that eventually dissolved into trackless prairie. Willow Creek appeared as a line of cottonwood trees against the sky, their leaves already turning yellow with approaching autumn. The land itself was exactly as advertised, flat, treeless, except for the creek bottom covered in waist-high grass that whispered secrets in the wind. No timber for building, no stones for a foundation, no shelter of any kind. Rebecca set down her canvas sack and pulled out her knife. The blade caught sunlight as she scored a large rectangle into the prairie grass, 10 feet wide, 16 feet long. The earth beneath was hard, compacted by millennia of root systems, but it yielded to the knife's pressure. She traced the outline 3 times, making sure the dimensions were exact. This would be her home. The sound of hoofbeats announced her first visitor. Michael Anderson rode a bay gelding, worth more than most settlers earned in a year. His posture radiating the casual confidence of inherited wealth. He reined in 20 feet away, studying Rebecca's rectangle in the grass with the bemused expression of someone watching a child play make-believe. His voice carried across the prairie, "Not unkind, but thoroughly dismissive, young lady. You won't last 4 weeks out here. This territory isn't for a girl alone." Rebecca continued her work, not bothering to look up. Michael's horse shifted, sensing his rider's impatience. "I own the spread 3 miles west, two-story house going up as we speak. I'm looking for household help. $3 monthly plus room and board. Better than ending up frozen in some ditch." Rebecca straightened, meeting his gaze directly. Her voice was quiet, but carried perfect clarity. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Anderson, but I've spent 3 years cleaning other people's houses. I'm done with that." Michael's expression shifted from bemusement to concern. He leaned forward in his saddle. "You got any idea what you're doing out here? Any experience building? Any understanding of what winter means this far north?" "I'm learning. Learning takes time. Winter doesn't wait." Michael gathered his reins, preparing to leave. "Offer stands until the first snow. After that, you're on your own." He rode off, and Rebecca returned to her rectangle. She'd completed one full circuit when the second visitor arrived, Sheriff Kenneth Taylor, approaching on foot, a leather-bound manual tucked under one arm. He stopped at the edge of her traced outline, using his boot to test the prairie sod. His manner was formal, almost apologetic, as if he regretted what he had to say. "According to my Frontier Survival Manual, single women require male oversight. It's not personal, it's survival science." Rebecca drove her knife into the ground, leaving it standing upright. She brushed dirt from her hands. "Then your manual is wrong." Kenneth's eyebrows rose. He opened the manual to a marked page, cleared his throat. Section 7, Paragraph 3, female homesteaders face mortality rates 43% higher than male counterparts due to reduced physical capacity, and Rebecca cut him off, her voice still quiet but edged with steel. "Sheriff, I've read manuals. I've followed rules. I've done everything right according to people who claimed they knew best. And all it got me was thrown onto a street in Chicago with $200 and nowhere to go. So forgive me if I don't put much faith in your statistics." Kenneth closed the manual slowly. His face reddened, though whether from anger or embarrassment was unclear. He adjusted his hat. "Your choice, Miss Clark, but when winter comes, don't expect rescue. I won't risk my men for someone who refused reasonable advice." The third visitor arrived as the sun touched the western horizon, painting the prairie gold and amber. Pastor Thomas Wright walked with the careful gait of someone whose knees had started failing, his black coat dusty from the trek. He carried a Bible and the certain conviction of a man who'd spent 50 years believing he spoke for God. He stood at the edge of Rebecca's traced rectangle and shook his head slowly, as if grieving a death that hadn't happened yet. His voice was gentle, which somehow made it worse. "You should pray for a swift marriage, child. The Almighty offers no shelter to fools who challenge Mother Nature." Rebecca had been kneeling, checking her measurements. She rose, brushing grass from her skirt. "Then I'll build my own shelter. God helps those who help themselves, Pastor." Thomas's gentle expression hardened. "Pride comes before the fall, young lady. The Lord gave us hands to build upward toward heaven, not downward into muck like animals." Rebekah met his gaze without flinching. "The Lord also gave us the ground we stand on, and the earth knows how to shelter its children." Thomas opened his Bible, clearly preparing to quote Scripture in rebuttal, but Rebekah had already turned back to her work. She heard him mutter something about stubborn youth as he walked away, his footsteps fading into the prairie silence. Alone again, Rebekah pulled her grandfather's journal from her sack. The pages fell open to an entry dated March 1847, written in cramped handwriting that slanted heavily to the right. Her grandfather had been 23 when he wrote it, hiding in an earth shelter while British soldiers searched the hillsides for Irish farmers who'd refused to abandon their land during the potato famine. The entry described construction techniques in precise detail. How to select the proper depth, 6 feet minimum, where soil temperature remained stable regardless of season. How to excavate without causing collapse. How to create thermal mass using whatever stones could be gathered. How to roof with living sod that breathed while insulating. At the bottom of the entry, in darker ink, added years later, her grandfather had written a single line: "The earth remembers summer through the deepest winter. Trust it." Rebekah read the words 3 times, committing them to memory, then tucked the journal away and picked up her knife. The prairie grass parted beneath the blade, revealing dark soil underneath. She began to dig. The work was immediately brutally difficult. Dakota topsoil had been compacted by thousands of years of prairie grass roots, creating a dense mat that resisted every attempt at penetration. Rebekah used her knife to cut through the root layer, then scooped earth with her bare hands, depositing it in a growing pile beside her excavation. After 1 hour, she'd removed approximately 6 inches of soil from a 2-foot square section. Her hands were already blistering. Her back ached from the constant bending. Sweat soaked through her dress, despite the cooling evening air. She worked until darkness made further progress impossible, then spread her wool blanket on the ground beside her pit and lay down fully clothed. The stars emerged in impossible numbers, more than she'd ever seen through Chicago's coal smoke. The prairie wind carried the smell of grass and distant water. Somewhere far off, a coyote called its voice, rising and falling like grief made audible. Rebekah stared at the stars and thought about her mother's last words, about her grandfather's journal, about the $200 that represented 3 years of swallowed pride and scraped-together pennies, about Michael Anderson's dismissive certainty, Sheriff Taylor's statistics, Pastor Wright's biblical condemnation. Tomorrow she would dig deeper, the day after, deeper still. She would excavate her survival from prairie soil with nothing but determination and her grandfather's remembered wisdom. She would prove every one of them wrong, not with words, but with the simple fact of continued existence. She fell asleep with dirt under her fingernails and woke to pain. Her hands had stiffened overnight blisters, splitting and weeping clear fluid. Her spine felt twisted, each vertebra grinding against its neighbor. Her shoulders burned with the memory of yesterday's labor. Rebekah sat up slowly, assessing the damage with the clinical detachment of someone who understood that pain was simply information about the body's current state. The information was clear: she'd barely started, and her body was already breaking down. She pulled on her coat against the morning chill and examined yesterday's excavation. The pit measured roughly 2 feet by 2 feet by 6 inches deep. Her target was 10 feet by 16 feet by 6 feet deep. Even accounting for the fact that soil would become easier to work once she broke through the root layer, she was looking at weeks of sustained digging, weeks of this pain multiplied. Rebecca drank water from her canteen, ate a piece of hard bread, and picked up her knife. She had no choice but to continue. Stopping meant admitting defeat, and defeat meant becoming exactly what Gary Young had claimed: she was useless, worthless, disposable. She worked through the morning in a fog of discomfort, making slow progress. The sun climbed higher, turning the prairie into a golden ocean. Meadowlarks called from invisible perches. The wind never stopped, constant and impartial, carrying the smell of grass and approaching autumn. Around noon on the third day, a voice interrupted her rhythm. "Child, I know what you're building." Rebecca's spun knife raised instinctively. An elderly black woman stood 10 feet away, having approached with such silence that Rebecca hadn't heard her coming. She held a tin cup in wrinkled hands, steam rising from whatever liquid it contained. The woman's face carried the mapped history of 68 hard years' lines etched deep around eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. She wore a faded calico dress, a wool shawl despite the afternoon warmth, and boots that had been repaired so many times the original leather was barely visible. Her voice, when she continued, held the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being ignored but not deterred. "I lived in one during slavery days. We called it a hidey hole." Rebecca lowered the knife slowly. She studied the woman's face, searching for mockery or condescension, and finding neither. Just weary recognition, as if she'd identified a familiar pattern in Rebecca's actions. The woman stepped closer, extending the tin cup. Steam carried the smell of mint and something bitter. "Drink this. Your hands need it." Rebecca hesitated, then accepted the cup. The liquid was hot enough to scald some kind of tea made from plants she didn't recognize. She sipped carefully while the woman settled herself on the ground beside Rebecca's growing pit, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints no longer cooperated reliably. "My name is Shirley Allen. Been in Millwood 8 years. Before that, Kentucky, Ohio, and a dozen places I try to forget." The woman's eyes tracked the dimensions of Rebecca's excavation with professional assessment. "You planning to go down 6 feet?" Rebecca set down the cup. "That's the plan." Shirley nodded slowly. "Smart. Below 6 feet, earth temperature stays stable. 50 to 60 degrees winter and summer both. Like being wrapped in a blanket that never gets hot or cold, just holds you steady." Rebecca felt something shift in her chest, the unexpected relief of being understood rather than dismissed. "You've built one of these before?" "Built, child. I lived in them for months at a time." Shirley's gaze drifted somewhere past the horizon, seeing things Rebecca couldn't. "When the masters hunted runaways on the Underground Railroad, we hid in earth shelters, sometimes for weeks, sometimes longer. The ground kept us warm when nothing else would, kept us hidden when trees were bare and dogs were tracking." The words hung between them, carrying weight Rebecca only partially understood. She knew about the Underground Railroad in the abstract way any educated person knew history facts, dates, the broad strokes of events that happened before her birth. But sitting beside this woman who'd lived through it, who'd survived by literally burrowing into the earth to escape people who considered her property history, became something different, something immediate and real. Shirley seemed to sense Rebecca's thoughts. She reached down, scooping up a handful of soil, letting it run through her fingers. This ground doesn't care what color you are, doesn't care if you're running or hiding or just trying to survive winter. It protects what needs protecting if you know how to ask. How do you ask? Rebecca's voice was quieter than she'd intended. You dig. You respect what you're taking. You don't fight the earth, you work with it. Shirley stood her knees, cracking audibly. I'll be back tomorrow. Bring you a proper shovel. This knife-and-hands approach will take you till Christmas. Rebecca wanted to refuse accepting help, felt dangerous, like incurring a debt she couldn't repay. But Shirley was already walking away, moving across the prairie with surprising speed for someone her age. Rebecca called after her, "Why would you help me?" Shirley stopped, but didn't turn around. Her voice carried back on the wind because I remember being alone, and I remember people who helped when they didn't have to. That's how we survive, child. Not by being strong enough to do it all ourselves, but by being wise enough to accept help when it's offered. She disappeared over a small rise, leaving Rebecca alone with the mint tea and the half-dug pit, and the first fragile thread of something that might become hope if she wasn't careful. Shirley returned the next morning, carrying a shovel that had clearly seen better days. The handle was wrapped with cloth to cover splits in the wood, and the blade showed signs of having been sharpened multiple times, wearing it thinner than factory standard. But it was functional, and compared to Rebecca's knife-and-hands method, it was a miracle. The old woman didn't offer explanation or ask permission. She simply handed Rebecca the shovel and said, "Had this since '47. Dug my freedom with it. Reckon you're digging yours." Rebecca wanted to ask what payment Shirley expected, what hidden cost would emerge later, but something in the woman's face stopped her. This wasn't a transaction. This was something else, something Rebecca didn't have a name for, but recognized instinctively as important. She closed her fingers around the shovel handle. "I can't afford to pay you." Shirley's expression didn't change. Didn't ask for payment, asked for company. Gets lonely being the only one who remembers. Over the following days, a routine established itself. Shirley arrived each morning around dawn, bringing water or tea, or occasionally hard bread she'd baked the night before. They worked together in companionable silence, with Shirley offering guidance. When Rebecca's technique faltered, how to read different soil layers, where to find the best clay for mortar, which cottonwood trees along the creek were dead and could be harvested without guilt. In exchange, Rebecca read aloud in the evenings, working through her mother's poetry book and grandfather's journal by lantern light. Shirley listened with the intense focus of someone encountering written words as if they were treasure. She'd never learned to read, had never had the opportunity during slavery, and had been too busy surviving afterward. One evening, as Rebecca read an entry describing her grandfather's first winter in an earth house, Shirley interrupted, "Your grandfather was Irish." Rebecca nodded without looking up from the page. British took their land, burned their homes. Shirley's voice carried a knowing edge. During the potato famine, the poorest families survived by digging into hillsides. Shirley was quiet for a long moment. Then softly, "Turns out the ground protects all kinds of unwanted people. White, Irish, black runaways. Probably others too. Maybe that's what the earth does takes in what the powerful try to throw away." Rebecca stopped reading. She met Shirley's eyes across the lantern light and understood finally why this woman had appeared 3 days into her excavation carrying a shovel and asking nothing in return. They were both refugees from a world that had decided they were disposable, both building survival from dirt because nothing else was offered. She returned to reading, but something had shifted between them from simple cooperation to recognition of shared experience. By late October, the pit had reached its full dimensions, 10 feet wide, 16 feet long, 6 feet deep. At that depth, the soil had transformed from hard-packed topsoil to darker, damper earth that yielded more easily to the shovel. The walls were smooth, packed tight by Rebecca's bare hands, working the clay like dough. The floor was level, ready for its foundation of river stones. Shirley had taught her to read the soil's memory, how the darker layers held moisture, how certain textures indicated better insulation, how to recognize the point where seasonal temperature fluctuations stopped mattering. Now came the foundation work. Rebecca needed river rocks, hundreds of pounds of them, to create thermal mass that would absorb and radiate heat. The nearest source was Willow Creek, a quarter-mile from her excavation site. She made her first trip at dawn, carrying stones in the fold of her skirt. The rocks were smooth polished by current, each weighing between 1 and 3 pounds. She could transport perhaps 20 pounds per trip if she moved carefully. The math was brutal. She needed approximately 800 pounds of stone. That meant 40 trips minimum, likely more accounting for rest and the fact that not every rock would be suitable. Rebecca started walking. The work took 2 weeks. Each morning she woke, ate a small breakfast, and began the rhythm of creek to pit to creek. Her legs grew stronger, her back adjusted to the constant bending and lifting. She developed calluses on top of her blisters, then those calluses hardened into armor. Settlers passing by on the rutted track to town watched her labor with expressions ranging from pity to contempt. Nobody offered help. Nobody suggested she was doing something sensible. A few made jokes about the crazy girl building a rock garden in a hole in the ground. Rebecca ignored them all. Her world had narrowed to a simple equation. Stones carried equaled future warmth, equaled survival. Everything else was noise. By mid-November, the foundation was complete. 800 pounds of river rock covered the floor of her dugout in a layer roughly 6 inches deep. The stones formed a thermal battery. They would absorb heat from her fire and release it slowly, maintaining steady temperature long after the flames died. Next came the roof framework. Rebecca needed logs, but cutting living trees was both wasteful and beyond her physical capacity. Instead, she scavenged the creek bottom for deadfall cottonwood trees that had died standing and eventually toppled, their wood seasoned but still solid. She found 14 suitable logs, each approximately 4 inches in diameter and 8 feet long. Getting them from creek to dugout required a different kind of determination. Rebecca tied rope around her waist, looped it around a log, and dragged. The first log took 2 hours to move a quarter mile. Her shoulders screamed. Her hands, still healing from earlier blisters, reopened and bled. She had to stop every 30 feet to catch her breath and convince her body to continue. By the fourth log, she'd developed a technique, smaller pulls with more frequent rests, using her legs rather than her back, accepting pain as information rather than obstacle. By the 7th log, the work had become meditation. Her mind wandered while her body executed the familiar pattern of pull, rest, breathe, repeat. Michael Anderson's 3 sons rode past during her 9th log, their horses dancing sideways at the sight of Rebecca straining against the rope. The oldest boy, 14, called out with the casual cruelty of adolescence, "Mole girl, living in a hole like an animal." His brothers laughed, and they galloped off, leaving Rebecca alone with her rope and her log, and the knowledge that their father would hear about this and form new opinions about her mental state. She kept pulling. The 14 logs went across the width of her dugout, spaced 12 inches apart, creating a ribbed framework. On top of these, Rebecca would stack sod blocks, prairie grass cut in sections, the living roots holding soil together in dense bricks. She'd watched Shirley demonstrate the cutting technique. The knife sliced through grass and the top 3 inches of soil, creating blocks approximately 12 inches wide, 24 inches long, and 3 inches thick. Each block weighed between 40 and 50 pounds, heavy enough that Rebecca could barely lift them. She needed roughly 120 blocks to create 3 layers of sod roofing, 9 inches of living earth that would insulate while allowing airflow through the grass roots. Rebecca spent 8 days cutting and stacking sod. Her technique improved with repetition. She learned to cut at an angle that made lifting easier to roll the blocks, rather than trying to carry them to stack them with grass side down so roots interlocked. The work was exhausting, but no longer overwhelming. Her body had adapted to sustained physical labor. Muscles she hadn't known existed had strengthened. The girl who'd arrived in September office, soft from 3 years of domestic work, had been remade into something harder and more capable. By November's end, her dugout had walls and a roof. The front face still needed construction, vertical cottonwood logs chinked with clay mortar. A wooden door, salvaged from an abandoned wagon near the creek leather hinges because she couldn't afford metal. Shirley helped with the mortar, mixing creek clay with dried grass and water, creating a paste that would dry harder than stone. They worked side by side, packing the mixture into every gap, every crack, every potential pathway for cold air to enter. The final element was heating. Rebecca couldn't afford an iron stove. Those cost upward of $50 more than a quarter of her remaining savings. Instead, she built a firebox from river stones, stacking them in the dugout's far corner to create a small hearth. For the flue, she scavenged discarded kerosene tins from the settlement's trash pile. She flattened them, linked them with clay mortar, and created a makeshift chimney that extended through the sod roof. It was crude, inefficient by conventional standards, and completely functional. Her total construction cost came to $27. Hand tools, filing fees, miscellaneous supplies. The rest of her money, $173, would go toward provisions and emergency reserves. On November 1st, with the first hard frost painting the prairie white, Rebecca lit her first fire. She used twigs thinner than her pinky finger, gathered over weeks and stored in the dugout's dry corner. The kindling caught immediately, flames licking upward into the tin flue. Smoke drafted perfectly, pulled outside by the chimney effect. Heat began to radiate from the stone firebox. Rebecca closed her crooked door and waited. Within 20 minutes, the temperature inside had risen from the ambient 55 degrees of 6-foot-deep earth to 62 degrees. She fed the fire carefully, adding twigs one at a time, watching the effect. At 30 minutes, the temperature reached 64 degrees and stabilized. The river rocks in her foundation had begun absorbing heat. The clay walls trapped it. The tons of prairie soil surrounding her on 5 sides acted as insulation so complete that virtually no warmth escaped. Rebecca let the fire burn down to embers, then die completely. She sat on her bedroll and watched the thermometer she'd purchased in town. The temperature dropped slightly 63 degrees, then held steady. The thermal mass was working. The foundation stones were releasing stored heat. The system was functioning exactly as her grandfather's journal had promised. For the first time since being thrown onto a Chicago street, Rebecca cried. Not from despair or exhaustion, but from the simple, overwhelming relief of success. She'd built something real, something that worked, something that belonged only to her and couldn't be sold, traded, or taken without her consent. She slept that night wrapped in her wool blanket, lying directly on the stone floor, breathing air that didn't freeze her lungs or make her body shake. The wind howled outside, but inside was silence broken only by the occasional pop of a cooling ember. The earth was keeping its promise, holding summer's memory through autumn's chill, preparing to shield her through winter's fury. What the people of Millwood didn't know yet, what they couldn't know, blinded by their certainty that conventional methods were the only correct methods, was that Rebecca Clark had just built the only structure within 60 miles that would survive what was coming. And in 52 days, those same people who'd mocked her would be hammering on her door begging for their lives, willing to abandon every assumption they'd ever held about proper construction and suitable shelter. But that was winter's lesson to teach, for now Rebecca was simply warm, safe, and alive against all predictions. She'd dug her freedom from prairie dirt, and the earth patient and impartial had welcomed her home. November arrived with frost that turned the prairie grass silver before dawn, and melted by noon, a daily reminder that the real cold hadn't begun. The settlement of Millwood prepared for winter with the frantic energy of people who understood that mistakes made now would be paid for in frozen fingers or worse. Michael Anderson's mansion rose against the skyline like a monument to conventional wisdom. 2 stories of mill lumber glass windows, shipped from Chicago, painted trim that gleamed white in the afternoon sun. The construction had consumed $850 in materials alone, another $200 for the cast iron stove that dominated the parlor, $150 for hardware, and the skilled labor of a carpenter from Bismarck, who'd spent 3 weeks ensuring every joint was square and every nail properly driven. The house was beautiful. It was also failing. The problem revealed itself gradually like a wound that doesn't hurt until you notice the blood. The massive stove devoured cordwood at a rate Michael hadn't anticipated, 6 hours of burning just to maintain 55 degrees inside when the temperature outside dropped to freezing. Heat rose through the open interior, up the stairs to the 2nd floor, then bled through ceiling joists and shingles into the November sky. The walls, despite being properly constructed according to every manual and specification, had thousands of tiny gaps where boards met, where windows seated into frames, where the structure breathed in ways that seemed insignificant until winter started testing them. Michael's 3 sons, Brandon, aged 8, Colin, 11, David, 14, spent 2 hours every morning chopping cordwood to feed the insatiable stove. Their hands developed blisters that hardened into calluses. Their backs ached from the repetitive swing of the axe. And still the woodpile shrank faster than Michael's calculations had predicted. His wife Patricia watched their reserves dwindle with growing anxiety. She didn't say anything, not yet, but her eyes tracked the stack of split logs beside the house, measuring what remained against the months of winter still to come. 3 miles east, Sheriff Kenneth Taylor's cabin demonstrated what happened when theory met reality. He'd built it exactly according to his frontier survival manual, precisely hewn timbers, clay chinking between every log, a steeply pitched roof covered in cedar shakes. The specifications were sound. The execution was flawless. The total cost was $520. The cabin was also cold. The wet clay chinking had performed beautifully through September and October, sealing gaps and creating what Kenneth believed was an airtight envelope. Then the temperature began dropping consistently below freezing at night, and the clay responded by shrinking. Hairline cracks appeared first, barely visible. Within a week, those cracks had widened to gaps you could slide a knife blade through. Kenneth and his wife Linda spent their afternoons stuffing rags into the expanding fissures, only to find new ones the next morning. The cold found every weakness with the persistence of water seeking its level. Drafts whispered through the cabin at night, making the lantern flames dance and forcing Linda to sleep in her day clothes under every quilt they owned. Kenneth consulted his manual repeatedly, searching for the section on clay shrinkage in extreme cold. The manual, written by a professor in Pennsylvania who'd never spent a winter on the Dakota plains, didn't mention it. Pastor Thomas Wright's house predated the current settlement by 8 years, built during the first optimistic wave of homesteading that had preceded the harsh reality of sustained habitation. The structure was clapboard over timber, framing serviceable, but never grand-roofed with tar-treated canvas because proper shingles had been beyond the original owner's budget. The canvas was failing. 8 years of sun, wind, and temperature swings had made it brittle. The first significant snowfall of November, 6 inches of wet, heavy accumulation, caused visible sagging in 3 places. Thomas climbed onto the roof with a broom to sweep it clear, and the canvas tore under his boot, creating a saucer-sized hole that let melted snow drip directly onto the dining table. He patched it with pitch and a scrap of blanket, but the damage exposed a deeper problem. The entire roof was compromised, weak enough that the next major snow load might cause catastrophic failure. Thomas prayed about it nightly, asking God to hold the canvas together through the winter, to spare them the expense of replacement they couldn't afford. His wife Brenda, already weakened by the chronic cough that had plagued her for 2 years, grew worse in the drafty house. She spent most days in bed, wrapped in quilts, her breathing wet and labored. Their daughters, Sarah and Emma, ages 9 and 6, learned to be quiet around their mother, to tiptoe and whisper, and not ask for things that required energy she didn't have. Eric Walker had arrived in Millwood 2 months before Rebecca, claiming land a mile south of her plot. He was 24 second-generation Norwegian, but American-born, carrying his father's carpentry skills and $380 saved from 2 years working construction in Minneapolis. He'd built his cabin the right way, or so he'd believed. Traditional log construction, medium-quality materials, competent execution. The structure was solid square, properly chinked. It should have been warm. Instead, Eric woke every morning to frost on the inside walls. His breath made clouds in the air, despite the fire he kept burning through the night. He could feel heat rising, gathering near the ceiling where it did him no good, then escaping through invisible gaps in the roof assembly. He'd visited Rebecca's dugout 3 times in late October, ostensibly to check if she needed help, but actually to study what she'd built. The earthen shelter made no sense according to every principle he'd learned. It violated basic assumptions about construction, that shelter required walls that stood above ground, that proper insulation meant wood or brick, that heating required substantial fuel consumption. Yet, when he'd stood at her door asking if she needed anything, warm air had rolled out from the interior like a physical presence. The contrast between her underground room at 64 degrees and his cabin at 48 degrees was undeniable and deeply embarrassing. Rebecca's routine had settled into rhythms dictated by necessity rather than convention. She woke when gray dawn light filtered through cracks around her door, usually around 7. A small fired twigs, barely thicker than matches, burning for 20 minutes, brought the temperature from its overnight low of 61 degrees back to 64. She boiled water for washing and made simple breakfast from her provisions. The rest of her day was hers. She read from her 3 books, worked on small improvements to the dugout, or simply rested in the unprecedented luxury of being warm without constant effort. 2 fires daily, morning and evening, consumed less fuel than she could gather in an hour of walking the creek bottom. The settlement noticed. Women whispered in church about the unnatural girl living like an animal in the ground. Men debated whether her survival thus far was luck or something more troubling, an indication that perhaps conventional wisdom wasn't as universally applicable as they'd believed. Helen Moore, 7 months pregnant and increasingly uncomfortable in the cabin she shared with her husband Roger, visited Rebecca in early November. The walk from her homestead took 40 minutes, and she arrived breathless, one hand supporting her swollen belly. Rebecca opened the door to find her leaning against the frame. Helen's face was pale, her lips slightly blue, despite the relatively mild day. Her voice came out thin. "May I sit down?" Just for a moment. Rebecca guided her inside, settling her on the bedroll near the hearthstones. The warmth seemed to revive Helen immediately. Color returned to her cheeks. Her breathing steadied. She looked around the dugout with wonder. "How are you staying so warm? Roger's burning wood constantly, and our cabin barely reaches 50 degrees. Rebecca explained the principles: thermal mass earth insulation, stable temperature at depth. Helen listened with the focused attention of someone for whom this wasn't theoretical. She was going to give birth within 2 months in a house that couldn't maintain adequate warmth. Helen's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Roger won't believe me if I tell him. He thinks his way is the only way. He's proud." Rebecca understood proud men. She'd been raised by one. Most men are. It's how they survive being wrong. They just refuse to admit it. Helen laughed, then winced as the baby kicked. She placed Rebecca's hand on her belly so she could feel the movement. The life pressing against her palm was immediate and urgent, a reminder that winter wasn't an abstract threat, but a specific danger to specific people. "Will you come to me when the baby arrives?" Helen's eyes were serious. "Roger built the cabin, but he doesn't know anything about keeping someone alive when they're vulnerable. I trust you more than I trust him." Rebecca had no experience with childbirth beyond theoretical knowledge from books, but she recognized the question beneath the question, not whether she knew what to do, but whether she would try. "Yes. When you need me, send Roger. I'll come." Helen left an hour later, walking back toward her inadequate cabin and her proud husband and the approaching birth that terrified her in ways she couldn't articulate. The settlement's hostility toward Rebecca crystallized in mid-November when Jeffrey Lewis appeared at her door with a legal claim that her land wasn't actually hers. Lewis was 43, rough around the edges in a way that suggested violence as a first resort, known throughout Millwood for claim-jumping, filing fraudulent paperwork to steal established homesteads from people who couldn't afford legal fights. He stood outside her dugout, not bothering to knock, just shouting, "You're squatting on my land, girl." "I filed before you did. Check with the land office." Rebecca emerged into the cold afternoon. She kept her knife visible at her belt, not threatening but present. "Sheriff Taylor is investigating. Until then, I'm not going anywhere." Lewis's smile was unpleasant. "Winter might solve this for me. You'll be dead, and I'll take what's mine." Rebecca met his gaze without flinching. "We'll see who survives, Mr. Lewis." He left, but the threat remained. Rebecca knew his type men who took what they wanted and used law as a weapon when force wasn't convenient. She also knew that Sheriff Taylor's investigation would be slow, hampered by bureaucracy and the fact that land office records were inconsistent at best. The legal threat hung over her like the approaching winter, another problem without immediate solution. Michael Anderson's sons rode past her dugout 3 days later, deliberately veering close enough that their horses' hooves threw dirt clods against her door. The oldest boy, David, shouted as they passed Mole Girl. "Living in a hole like an animal," his brothers took up the chant, their voices carrying across the prairie until distance swallowed them. Rebecca listened from inside, sitting beside her warm hearth, and felt nothing but pity. They were children, parroting their father's judgment, unaware that their mockery would age poorly. The first test came November 18th. The storm announced itself through signs that settlers had learned to read horses refusing to settle in their stalls, birds flying south in agitated flocks, a peculiar yellow tint to the afternoon sky. Old-timers at the general store muttered about a practice run, a warm-up for the real cold that would arrive in December. The temperature dropped from 35 degrees to 8 degrees in 4 hours. Snow began falling around 6 in the evening, fat flakes that quickly accumulated. By midnight, 6 inches covered the prairie, with winds gusting to 35 miles per hour. Michael Anderson's stove consumed wood as fast as his sons could feed it, but the house temperature dropped to 48 degrees despite the roaring fire. Patricia woke him at 2 in the morning. "Brandon's lips are turning purple. He can't get warm." The 8-year-old boy lay under 4 quilts, shivering violently, his small body unable to generate enough heat to compensate for what the cold stole away. Michael wrapped him in another blanket, brought him downstairs to sit directly beside the stove. It helped marginally, but the boy's teeth still chattered, and his fingernails showed the faint blue of inadequate circulation. Michael's pride warred with his fear. He'd spent over $1,000 on this house. He'd followed expert advice. He'd done everything correctly, according to every manual and every experienced builder he'd consulted. The fact that it wasn't enough felt like personal failure, like evidence of weakness he couldn't afford to acknowledge. Sheriff Kenneth Taylor discovered that snow accumulated on his cabin roof at a rate that made the structure groan. He climbed up at 3 in the morning, using a ladder and a shovel to clear the load before the roof timbers failed. The wind hit him like a fist, nearly knocking him from the ladder. He managed to shovel half the roof before his hands went numb, and he retreated inside, praying the remaining snow wouldn't be enough to cause collapse. Linda huddled by the fire, praying aloud in a steady stream of words that might have been conversation with God, or simply the sound of fear given voice. Pastor Thomas Wright's patched canvas roof developed a new tier dinner plate sized that funneled snow directly into the parlor. He tried to climb up and fix it in the middle of the storm, but the wind was too strong and the canvas too brittle. He settled for stringing a tarp beneath the hole to catch the snow before it hit the floor. Brenda's cough worsened dramatically in the cold. Her fever spiked to 102 degrees. The girls huddled beside her in bed, trying to share body heat, while Thomas fed the fire and wondered if his wife would survive to see Christmas. Eric Walker's cabin temperature dropped to 38 degrees despite every effort. He could see his breath indoors. The fire roared but accomplished nothing except consuming his wood reserves at an alarming rate. He wrapped himself in every piece of clothing he owned and tried to sleep, but the cold was too invasive for rest. Around 4 in the morning, admitting defeat, he pulled on his boots and coat and stumbled through the storm toward Rebecca's dugout. The half-mile walk took 30 minutes. He arrived half-frozen, hammering on her door. Rebecca opened immediately. Warm air poured out, shocking in its contrast to the bitter wind. Eric stood there, snow-covered and shaking. "I built wrong. Everything I thought I knew was wrong. Come inside." Rebecca pulled him into the warmth. Eric collapsed onto her floor, his body convulsing with shivers as warmth forced sensation back into extremities that had gone numb. Rebecca made him strip his wet outer layers, wrapped him in her blanket, forced him to drink hot water. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't point out that he'd had weeks to learn from her example. She simply tended to him until the shaking stopped and color returned to his face. Eric looked around the dugout with new understanding. The stone hearth held banked embers barely glowing. No active fire, yet the temperature was comfortable enough that he'd stopped shivering completely. Everything he'd learned about construction, every principle he'd absorbed from his carpenter father, had proven inadequate. This underground room, built by a 16-year-old girl with a knife and a shovel, outperformed his $380 cabin by every meaningful metric. "I want to learn." His voice was quiet but certain. "When this storm ends, will you teach me?" Rebecca studied him, searching for mockery or condescension, and finding neither. Just honest recognition of failure and the willingness to learn from someone he'd initially dismissed. "If you're serious, yes." The storm broke 20 hours later. The settlement emerged to find snowdrifts 2 feet high, in places temperatures still hovering around zero, and 3 homesteads with significant damage. Kenneth Taylor's roof had partially collapsed on the north side. Thomas Wright's canvas roof was 40% torn away. Eric Walker's cabin had a blown-out window where wind pressure had exceeded the frame's capacity. Michael Anderson's house stood intact, but Brandon hadn't recovered. The boy's cough had turned wet and dangerous. His fever wouldn't break. His breathing sounded like cloth tearing. Patricia begged Michael to do something, anything. Michael's jaw was tight as he saddled his horse. Pride was one thing, watching his son die was another. He rode to Rebecca's dugout at dawn on November 21st, dismounting with the careful movements of a man who'd rehearsed what to say, but knew it wouldn't come out right. He stood at her door, hat in his hands. The words came out rough. "Miss Clark, my boy Brandon is dying. The cold is killing him inside my own house. I don't know what to do." Rebecca appeared in the doorway, reading his face. "How long has he been sick?" 3 days. Getting worse." Michael's voice cracked. "I spent $1,200 on that house. I did everything right. And my son is dying anyway. Bring him here, now." Rebecca's tone allowed no argument. Michael returned an hour later with Brandon wrapped in blankets, the boy's small body limp against his chest. Patricia had wanted to come, but Michael had refused. Someone needed to watch Colin and David. So he carried his youngest son alone through the cold morning to a hole in the ground he'd mocked just weeks earlier. Rebecca had prepared. The dugout was warm, but not hot, the temperature carefully controlled. She'd heated stones in her fire and wrapped them in cloth makeshift heating pads that wouldn't burn. She directed Michael to lay Brandon on her bedroll beside the hearth. The boy was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and rapid. His lips were bluish. His skin felt simultaneously hot and cold, fever burning through a body that couldn't maintain its own temperature. Shirley Allen arrived 30 minutes later carrying a cloth bag that rattled with dried herbs. She moved past Michael without acknowledging him, kneeling beside Brandon with the efficiency of someone who'd nursed people through worse. Willow bark for the fever. Her gnarled fingers sorted through bundles of dried plants. Mullein for his lungs. And this she pulled out something that looked like dried roots for the cold that's settling in his bones. She and Rebecca worked together, making teas and tinctures, forcing small sips past Brandon's cracked lips. Michael watched from the corner, feeling useless and stupid and terrified. His son's life was in the hands of 2 women he'd dismissed as irrelevant, one too young to know anything, the other too old and too black to matter. The irony wasn't lost on him. Brandon stayed in the dugout for 3 days. Slowly, incrementally, he improved. The steady warmth did what medicine alone couldn't, gave his body the stability it needed to fight infection instead of just struggling to maintain core temperature. The fever broke on the 2nd day. Color returned to his lips on the 3rd. By November 24th, he was sitting up, asking for food. Michael visited twice daily, watching his son recover in a shelter that had cost $27 while his $1,200 house sat empty and useless. Each visit carved away another piece of his certainty. On the 3rd day, as Rebecca walked Michael to the door while Brandon napped, Michael's voice was barely audible. "I bet $10 at the general store that you'd be dead by Christmas." Rebecca's expression didn't change. "I know. Everyone knows about the betting pool." Michael flinched. "I was wrong. About everything. This place," his gesture encompassed, "the dugout shouldn't work. It violates every principle I learned, but my son is alive because of it." Rebecca met his eyes. "The earth is saving him, Mr. Anderson. I just knew how to listen." Michael rode home and told Patricia the truth, that their son had survived because a teenage girl understood things he didn't. But when the men at the general store asked how Brandon was doing, Michael claimed the boy had recovered on his own, that he had a strong constitution, that it was just a temporary illness. Eric Walker overheard the exchange and felt disgust rise in his throat. Michael Anderson was too proud to admit that Rebecca had saved his son's life, too invested in his own expertise to acknowledge that he'd been catastrophically wrong. Eric waited until Michael left, then walked to Rebecca's dugout. He found her reading by lantern light, Brandon asleep in the corner. "I heard what Michael said in town, that Brandon recovered on his own." Rebecca shrugged. "I didn't do it for credit. I know. That's why I respect you." Eric sat near the door, keeping distance between them. "When this winter's over, would you teach me to build the right way?" Rebecca closed her book. "If we're both still alive, yes." The question hung between them, not whether she knew enough to teach, but whether either of them would survive what was coming. December arrived with temperatures that made November's cold seem gentle by comparison. The mercury dropped steadily, 22 degrees on December 1st, 12 degrees on the 7th, -5 on the 14th. Each morning was colder than the last, a progression that felt mechanical and pitiless. Michael Anderson was burning fence rails. His cordwood reserves had run out in early December weeks ahead of his calculations. Now he spent 3 hours daily chopping sections of the fence he'd built that summer, feeding them to the insatiable stove just to keep the interior temperature above 40 degrees. Patricia's cough had developed during Brandon's illness and never fully cleared. The constant smoke from wet wood feeding the stove didn't help. The boys slept in their day clothes under every quilt the family owned, and still they woke shivering. Kenneth Taylor had patched every crack in his cabin walls with mud rags and newspaper. Yet heat continued to escape through the ceiling, rising and bleeding away into the winter sky. He could stand beside the fire and feel warm air drafting upward past his face, could watch his breath make clouds despite the roaring fire 6 feet away. Linda had stopped asking when it would get better. She understood now that it wouldn't, that they'd chosen a fundamentally flawed design and would pay for it all winter. Thomas Wright's household had settled into a grim routine. Every 2 hours, someone had to wake and stoke the fire. If they let it die, the water in their buckets froze solid within 30 minutes. Brenda could barely eat, her body too weak to process food. The girls had stopped playing, conserving energy, moving through the house like small ghosts. Thomas prayed 4 hours daily, bargaining with God, making promises, asking why faith wasn't sufficient to keep his family warm. Helen Moore's husband, Roger, refused to ask Rebecca for advice. He was a man, a homesteader, someone who'd read books about frontier living. The idea that a teenage girl knew more than he did was intolerable. So their cabin stayed cold, and Helen grew thinner, and the baby inside her moved less frequently, as if it too was trying to conserve energy for the trial ahead. Helen visited Rebecca on December 15th, walking the 40 minutes in cold that made her lungs ache. She sat beside the warm hearth and cried silently, her hands pressed to her belly. The baby had stopped kicking. She could still feel movement occasionally, but the vigorous jabs and rolls had ceased. Rebecca made her tea, forced her to drink, held her while she wept. "Bring Roger here. Show him this works. Make him understand." Helen shook her head. "He won't listen. He says you're lucky that the cold just hasn't found you yet, that everyone knows proper houses need to be above ground." Rebecca's voice was flat. "Then let him freeze his pride. But when the baby comes, you come here, with or without his permission." On December 18th, Jeffrey Lewis confronted Rebecca at Willow Creek, where she was gathering water. He'd grown bolder as winter deepened, sensing that legal resolution would be slow and that physical intimidation might accomplish what paperwork couldn't. "You're still here." His tone suggested this was a temporary situation he intended to correct. Rebecca set down her water bucket, keeping her hands free. "Sheriff Taylor is reviewing the filing records. When he's done, we'll know who filed first." Jeffrey stepped closer, invading her space deliberately. "I know I filed first, and when Taylor confirms it, you'll have nowhere to go. Middle of winter, homeless, probably dead inside a week." Rebecca didn't retreat. "If your claim was legitimate, you wouldn't need to threaten me. You'd just wait for the law." Jeffrey's hand moved toward her, though whether he intended to grab or strike was unclear. He never completed the motion. Eric Walker's voice cut across the creek bed. "Miss Clark needs something." Jeffrey turned to find Eric standing 20 feet away, an axe resting casually on his shoulder. The carpenter's posture was relaxed, but his eyes were cold. Jeffrey reassessed the situation, decided intimidating one teenage girl was easier than fighting a grown man with a weapon, and left without another word. Eric waited until Jeffrey disappeared over the rise. "You all right?" Rebecca picked up her water bucket. "I can handle Jeffrey Lewis." "I know you can. Doesn't mean you should have to." Eric shifted the axe to his other shoulder. "When this winter's over, I'm planning to rebuild. Smaller, different design, based on what you did. I'd like to do it properly, which means I need you to teach me." The offer carried weight beyond simple construction advice. Eric was acknowledging not just that Rebecca's methods worked, but that they represented genuine innovation worth learning from. He was offering respect, the kind that didn't diminish with acknowledgement, but grew. Rebecca met his eyes. "Ask me again in spring, if we both survive." On December 20th, Shirley Allen visited Rebecca with a warning. The old woman's face was drawn, her movements more careful than usual, as if her bones were arguing with the cold. "Child, I've lived through 68 winters. I can feel when a bad one's coming. And tomorrow," Shirley's voice dropped, "tomorrow's going to be the worst I've ever felt." Rebecca set down the book she'd been reading. "How can you tell the horses won't settle? Birds flew south 3 days early. And my bones ache in a way they haven't since the winter of '64, when I watched 3 people freeze to death in a church that was supposed to shelter them." Shirley's eyes were distant, seeing old horrors. "You're safe here? You built right. But the others—" She shook her head slowly. "Lord have mercy on the others." Rebecca thought of Helen Moore, 8 months pregnant, in a cabin that couldn't hold warmth. Of Brandon Anderson, recovered but vulnerable. Of Eric Walker, stubborn enough to admit he'd been wrong, but still living in a structure that was trying to kill him. "Should I warn them?" Her voice was uncertain. Shirley's laugh was bitter. "They won't listen. Pride is a warm blanket until the real cold comes. Then it's just dead weight that drags you under." The next day, December 21st, the sky turned yellow-gray, a color that seemed fundamentally wrong. Draft horses across the settlement refused to calm pacing their corrals with ears pinned back. Dogs howled at nothing. The temperature stood at -18 degrees, and the sun hadn't even set. At the general store, old-timers who'd survived previous winters spoke in low voices. "A big one's coming, bigger than anything we've seen." Michael Anderson bought 3 additional cords of wood emergency reserves that cost him $20 he'd planned to save. Kenneth Taylor reinforced his roof supports, adding timber braces to prevent collapse. Thomas Wright prayed publicly in the street, asking God to spare them. Rebecca sealed every crack in her dugout with fresh clay, checked her door seal, stockpiled extra twigs, and filled every container with water. She lit her evening fire early, bringing the temperature to 65 degrees, then banked the embers carefully. At 6:47 that evening, the temperature was negative 18 degrees Fahrenheit. By midnight, it would reach negative 40, and the wind was building, gathering strength like a fist, pulling back before the strike. The storm hit at 8 o'clock with the violence of something that had been waiting, patient and hungry. Wind speeds jumped from 10 to 60 miles per hour in less than 20 minutes. Snow didn't fall. It flew horizontally, turning the world into a white void where you couldn't see your own hand extended at arm's length. The temperature plunged. Negative 20, negative 30, negative 37. Michael Anderson's stove consumed furniture. First, a chair, its legs crackling in the flames. Then another chair, then sections of the kitchen table. Patricia fed wood as fast as she could, while Michael used an axe to break apart anything that would burn. The boys huddled under every quilt, every blanket, every piece of fabric in the house. It wasn't enough. The cold found gaps in the construction, invisible pathways, through walls that had seemed solid in autumn. Drafts circulated like predatory fish, stealing warmth and replacing it with air that hurt to breathe. By 10 o'clock, the temperature inside Michael's $1,200 mansion had dropped to 34 degrees. Brandon's lips were turning purple again. Colin's hands were numb. David couldn't stop shivering, despite being wrapped in 4 quilts. Patricia's voice shook Michael. "They're freezing! Inside our own house, our children are freezing." Michael stared at the inadequate fire, at his inadequate house, at the inadequate results of his expensive, conventional wisdom. His pride died hard, fighting every step, but fear for his children was stronger. "We have to reach the girls' place. Rebecca, she has real heat. I've seen it." Patricia's response was immediate and visceral. "That dirty hole in the ground, you want to take our children to live like animals." Michael's voice came out raw. "The girl isn't freezing to death. We are." They bundled the children in every blanket they could carry, tied themselves together with rope so they wouldn't get separated in the whiteout, and stumbled into the storm. The half-mile to Rebecca's dugout should have taken 8 minutes. In the blizzard with 3 small children and visibility measured in inches, it took 40. The wind tried to lift them off their feet. Ice crystals pelted their faces like thrown sand. The cold penetrated every layer of clothing, found skin, and began the process of destroying tissue. Michael carried Brandon unconscious again. Patricia pulled Colin and David by the rope, praying aloud, though her words were stolen by the wind before they left her mouth. They found Rebecca's dugout by luck or divine intervention. Michael wasn't sure which and didn't care. He pounded on the door with numb fists. "Rebecca, please let us in. We're dying." The door opened. Warm air hit like a physical slap. The Anderson family tumbled inside, collapsing in a heap of snow-covered bodies and desperate breathing. The contrast was so extreme it registered as pain. Patricia sobbed uncontrollably. The boys shook violently, unable to speak. Michael knelt on the floor, snow melting off his coat, and felt the warmth work its way into his frozen core. Rebecca's voice cut through the chaos. "Strip your wet clothes, now, before the cold finishes you." She gave them her only blanket. Her bedroll positioned them beside the hearthstones that radiated steady warmth from embers hours old. She boiled water for tea, added precious salt for electrolytes, forced each person to drink. No judgment in her voice, no satisfaction at being proven right, just competent action focused on keeping people alive. Sheriff Kenneth Taylor arrived 2 hours later, his cabin roof partially collapsed under snow weight. He and Linda had fled with only the clothes on their backs, stumbling through the storm, following the same path Michael had broken. Rebecca squeezed them inside. 7 people now in a space designed for one. Pastor Thomas Wright arrived at dawn carrying his unconscious wife while his daughters clung to his coat. The canvas roof had torn away completely, snow filling their house like water filling a sinking ship. Thomas was weeping. "God forgive me. I told her you were building a grave, but you built salvation." Rebecca opened the door wider. "Bring them in." Eric Walker was last arriving just after sunrise, his cabin windows shattered and door torn off by wind pressure. He collapsed inside, barely conscious from cold exposure. 14 people crammed into 160 square feet, packed tighter than logic should allow, and yet warm, breathing, alive. The storm screamed outside -40 degrees, 60-mile-per-hour winds, snow accumulation measured in feet rather than inches. Inside the buried shelter, the temperature held themselves at 62 degrees, slightly lower than normal, due to the door opening repeatedly, but still comfortable. The thermal mass worked. The tons of prairie soil insulated. The system Rebecca had built for $27 performed while structures costing hundreds of times more failed catastrophically. Thomas Wright's voice was barely audible over the muffled storm. "I preached that God builds upward to heaven. I was wrong. God builds in every direction, and sometimes He builds salvation downward through the hands of a 16-year-old girl I called a fool." Nobody spoke after that. They sat in the dim lantern light, pressed against each other, listening to the wind try and fail to reach them. The earth held them, protected them, kept its ancient promise to shelter what humans rejected. Outside, Jeffrey Lewis froze to death in his cabin 4 miles north, his fraudulent land claim. Papers scattered across the floor where the wind had blown them through gaps in his walls. The blizzard continued through December 23rd without pause. Outside, the wind maintained its 60-mile-per-hour assault, occasionally gusting higher, creating drifts that buried fence posts and transformed the landscape into abstract geography. Inside the dugout, 14 people existed in a state that combined profound discomfort with profound gratitude. They were packed impossibly tight. Adults sat with knees drawn up, backs against earthen walls. Children slept in laps or curled in corners. The air grew thick with human exhalation, body heat, and the smell of too many unwashed people in too small a space. Nobody complained. Complaint required the luxury of alternatives, and there were none. Rebecca divided her provisions with mathematical precision. 3 days of food meant for one person distributed among 14. Stale bread received careful rationing. Each person got a piece roughly the size of 2 fingers. beans boiled down into thin soup that was more water than substance, but provided warmth and the illusion of fullness. She gave her own portions to the children, claiming she'd eaten earlier when she hadn't. Shirley Allen watched this redistribution with knowing eyes, but said nothing. She understood the calculus of sacrifice, had made similar calculations herself during weeks hidden underground while slave hunters combed the hillsides above. By noon on the 23rd, the initial shock had worn off enough for conversation. People shifted positions, trying to restore circulation to compressed limbs. Brandon Anderson dozed fitfully against his mother's chest. Brenda Wright's breathing had steadied in the consistent warmth, her fever dropping for the first time in weeks. Linda Taylor held her husband's hand and wept quietly, releasing tension that had built over months of fighting a losing battle against the cold. Michael Anderson broke the silence around hour 18. His voice carried the hollowness of someone confronting fundamental errors. "I don't understand how this works. How can this dwelling stay warm without a proper furnace, without timber walls, without anything proper at all?" Rebecca was checking the banked embers in her stone hearth, adding a single twig to maintain minimal heat. She didn't look up. "The walls are genuine, Mr. Anderson. They're made of earth." Michael's frustration leaked through. "I spent $1,200, followed expert advice, did everything correctly according to people who've built 100 houses, and you," his gesture encompassed the dugout, "you spent $27 and dug a hole. It shouldn't work." Rebecca finally met his gaze. The answer was simple, delivered without triumph or judgment. "Your experts wrote manuals for people who could afford mill lumber and iron stoves and glass windows. My grandfather wrote nothing down. He just survived when the British took everything and left Irish farmers with dirt and desperation. Different problems require different wisdom." She explained the physics in language stripped of technical jargon. Soil temperature at 6 feet deep remained between 50 and 60 degrees, regardless of what happened on the surface. Scientific fact, not belief. When she lit small fires, she wasn't trying to heat air that would rise and escape through inevitable gaps. She was heating clay and stone materials with high thermal mass that absorbed warmth and released it gradually over hours. The earth itself is insulation. Tons of prairie dirt surround us on 5 sides. That mass doesn't let heat bleed away like your walls do. Your iron stove heats air quickly, but air escapes through 1,000 tiny gaps. Here, the soil traps everything. Kenneth Taylor pulled his Frontier Survival Manual from his coat pocket, its pages damp from snow that had melted against his body during the desperate flight. He stared at the cover with something approaching hatred. "I followed this exactly. Every specification, every measurement, every technique. My cabin's roof caved in." He looked at Rebecca with genuine incomprehension. "You followed nothing but your grandfather's memory and your own instinct, and you built the only truly safe structure for 60 miles." The manual slipped from his fingers to the dirt floor. "When we get out of here, I'm burning this." Shirley Allen's voice cut through the darkness, carrying the weight of experience that predated everyone else's by decades. "Turns out the ground protects all kinds of unwanted people. White Irish during famine, black runaways during slavery. Poor homesteaders, the experts said, would die. Maybe that's what the earth does to takes in what the powerful try to throw away, and keeps it alive despite everything." Thomas Wright had been silent for hours, holding his wife, while their daughters slept against his legs. Now he spoke, his voice breaking. I told you the Lord builds upward to heaven. I said digging downward was against God's plan. I was so certain. Rebekah's response was gentle. Pastor God gave us the ground, same as he gave us the sky. The earth is as much his creation as heaven. Maybe he builds in every direction, and we're just too limited to see it all at once. Thomas wept openly, shoulders shaking. I'm 60 years old. I've preached for 40 years. And a 16-year-old girl just taught me more about God than I learned in all that time. The confession hung in the close air. Nobody rushed to comfort him because the moment required acknowledgement rather than absolution. Thomas Wright's certainty had nearly killed his family. The recognition of that fact needed space to exist before it could be processed. What nobody in that cramped dugout knew, what Rebekah would never tell them, was that she'd lain awake the previous night, listening to the wind, terrified her door seal would fail. Terrified the roof would cave under snow weight. Terrified she'd built her own grave after all, exactly as Thomas had predicted. She'd fallen asleep, whispering her mother's last words, like a prayer the soil protects its children when humans won't. When she'd woken to find 14 people begging at her door, she'd realized her mother was right. The earth had protected her, and through her it was protecting them all, the wealthy who'd mocked her poverty, the religious who'd condemned her methods, the educated who'd cited statistics proving her inevitable failure. The ground made no distinction between those who'd believed and those who'd doubted. It simply kept its promise to anyone who understood how to work with it rather than against it. The storm broke on Christmas morning. The wind died, gradually dropping from 60 miles per hour to 40 to 20 to finally still. Snow continued falling lightly for another hour, then stopped. The sky cleared to pale winter blue, crystalline and cold. Rebekah opened the door at 7:30 to find a landscape transformed beyond recognition. Snow drifts reached waist-high, in places sculpted by wind into shapes that bore no relationship to the flat prairie she remembered. The settlement structures were visible only as irregular humps in the white expanse, partially buried markers of human habitation. The temperature outside registered -22 degrees. Inside the dugout, it had stabilized at 62 overnight, the thermal mass continuing its patient work of releasing stored warmth. 14 people emerged, slowly moving with the stiffness of bodies that had been compressed too long. They climbed out into air so cold it felt solid, each breath an act of will. The morning light on snow was blinding. Several people shaded their eyes against the glare. Michael Anderson stood knee-deep in a drift, turning slowly to survey the damage. His mansion was visible 3 miles west. Windows, blown out, front door, hanging at an angle. The structure's proud lines compromised by forces it hadn't been designed to withstand. The sight hit him with physical force. Kenneth Taylor's cabin showed the collapsed roof clearly from a quarter-mile away. The northern section caved inward like a broken rib cage. Thomas Wright's house was a skeleton walls, standing but roof canvas completely gone, interior open to the sky. Eric Walker's cabin leaned dangerously, one wall pushed inward by wind pressure and snow accumulation. It would need to be torn down rather than repaired. Only Rebekah's dugout remained intact, buried under 3 feet of snow, but structurally sound. The difference was stark enough to silence conversation. Everyone could see the evidence expensive conventional construction had failed, while a $27 earth shelter succeeded. The human cost became clear over the following days as the settlement began digging out. 3 homesteads, too far from Rebecca to reach in the storm, had experienced total loss of life. The Harper family, 4 miles north elderly couple who'd homesteaded 8 years earlier, were found frozen in their bed, holding each other. Jeffrey Lewis, alone in his claim-jumped cabin, had died trying to burn furniture that wouldn't catch because the wood was too wet. Roger Moore, Helen's husband, had survived only because he'd been staying in the settlement proper, helping to reinforce the general store roof when the storm hit. He'd sheltered there with 6 others, burning merchandise to stay alive. The store owner's loss would be calculated later. Helen herself had been with her sister's family in town, safe, but terrified that Roger had tried to return home and died in the attempt. When she learned he'd survived, her relief was visible. When he told her their cabin was destroyed, she showed no emotion at all. The official count settled at 8 dead. Sheriff Kenneth Taylor recorded the names in his ledger with handwriting that shook slightly. He'd investigated Jeffrey Lewis's cabin and found the fraudulent land claim paperwork scattered across the floor, along with earlier versions that showed multiple attempts to forge filing dates. He rode to Rebecca's dugout on December 27th with documents in hand. His face carried the particular shame of someone who'd enforced the wrong side of a dispute. Jeffrey Lewis was running a fraud. Your claim was legitimate from the start. I should have trusted you. Rebecca accepted the validation without visible satisfaction. You believed the paperwork, most people would. Kenneth shook his head slowly. I believed the man because he looked like someone who'd know how to file correctly. I doubted you because you were young and female and alone. That's not about paperwork, that's about judgment. Bad judgment. The legal threat that had hung over Rebecca's claim evaporated with Jeffrey's death and the exposure of his fraud. The land was hers, undisputed, secured by nothing more than her refusal to be intimidated, and the fact that winter had killed the man trying to steal it. Michael Anderson approached her on the last day of December. He'd spent the week repairing what he could of his mansion, boarding up blown windows, resetting the front door, salvaging furniture that hadn't been burned. The work was temporary Band-Aid measures that wouldn't hold through the rest of winter. His pride had been dismantled piece by piece over the past 10 days. Now he stood at Rebecca's door with his hat in his hands, a position that seemed to pain him physically. Miss Clark, I want to rebuild, but this time I want to build correctly, like you. Will you teach me? Rebecca studied him, reading the cost of asking, why should I? You bet I'd die. Called me insane. Told your sons I was living like an animal. Michael flinched at each accusation. Because I was wrong, and I'm asking, please. The please carried weight. Michael Anderson didn't beg. That he was doing so now indicated genuine transformation, or at least the beginning of one. Tomorrow, bring a shovel and your sons. They should learn this too. Rebecca's acceptance was conditional and clear. But understand, I'm not teaching you to be charitable. I'm teaching you because your boys nearly died from your ignorance. If you want them to survive future winters, you need to build different. Michael arrived the next morning with Brandon, Colin, and David. The boys were quiet, stripped of their earlier mockery. Brandon especially stayed close to Rebecca, his 8-year-old loyalty having transferred completely to the person who'd saved his life twice. Rebecca taught them site selection. First, how to read land for drainage, how to identify the water table depth, how to test soil composition. Michael took notes in a leather journal he'd brought for the purpose, his handwriting careful and precise. She explained thermal mass, using demonstrations, heating stones in fire, then measuring how long they retained warmth. She showed them how to identify the 6-foot depth marker where temperature stability began. She described the balance between insulation and ventilation between ceiling gaps and allowing air exchange. David, the 14-year-old, asked the best questions. Why does warm air rise? How do stones hold heat? What makes clay different from regular dirt? Rebecca answered each one, not simplifying for his age, but trusting him to understand complex concepts explained clearly. She'd learned that people could grasp difficult ideas if you respected their intelligence while presenting information accessibly. On the third day, Michael handed her a legal deed, 10 acres of his best pasture land adjoining her creek plot. The deed's inscription had been written in careful script. To Rebecca Clark, who taught me that true wealth is knowledge, not coin, and that the wisdom of the poor outweighs the pride of the rich. Rebecca read it twice. I can't accept this. Michael's voice was firm. It's not payment, it's debt. I owe you my son's life twice over my family's lives and my own life. This doesn't settle it. Nothing ever will. But it's a start. The gift transformed Rebecca's holdings from marginal to substantial. 20 acres with water access represented real wealth, the foundation for long-term stability. She accepted it finally, understanding that refusal would insult Michael's attempt at restitution. Her first act was planting timber on the new acreage. Cottonwood cuttings from the creek willow saplings, whatever, would grow quickly and provide building material for future homesteaders. She wasn't stockpiling for herself, but creating resources for others who would face the same challenges she had. Kenneth Taylor's transformation was more dramatic and more public. On January 5th, he built a fire in front of the general store and invited the entire settlement to witness. He stood beside the flames, holding his frontier survival manual, the book that had guided his every decision for 2 years. His voice carried across the gathered crowd. I followed this manual like scripture. It nearly killed me and my wife. A 16-year-old with no formal education taught me more in 3 days than this book taught me in 2 years. He threw the manual into the fire. The pages caught immediately, curling and blackening the confident pronouncements of an Eastern professor turning to ash. Kenneth watched it burn with an expression that mixed grief and relief. I'm sorry I didn't listen sooner. I'm sorry I quoted statistics at you instead of trusting evidence. I'm sorry I was so certain I was right that I couldn't see when I was wrong. The crowd was silent. Many had read that same manual, had followed its advice, had built structures that were currently failing. Kenneth's public burning was an invitation, permission to admit collective error without losing face. Thomas Wright's sermon on January 8th became the settlement's emotional climax. The church was packed beyond capacity, people standing in aisles and crowding the doorway. Everyone who'd survived the blizzard wanted to hear what the pastor would say about the experience. Thomas stood at the pulpit, looking older than his 60 years. His voice was steady, but stripped of its usual certainty. I have been guilty of the sin of pride. I told a young woman that the Lord only builds toward heaven. I said digging into the earth was against God's plan. I was gravely, catastrophically mistaken. He gripped the pulpit's edges. God builds in every direction, upward, downward, inward. And deliverance comes from unexpected places, carried by unlikely saviors. A 16-year-old girl I called a fool saved my wife's life, my daughter's lives, and my own life. She did this while I was condemning her methods and predicting her death. His voice broke. I beg this congregation's forgiveness for my arrogance. But most of all, I ask pardon from Rebecca Clark, who showed me that faith without humility is just pride wearing a cross. Rebecca sat in the back pew, feeling exposed and uncomfortable. She hadn't wanted public recognition, had saved people because they needed saving, not to prove anything. But Thomas's confession mattered to others in the congregation who'd also doubted her, who'd also placed bets or made predictions or simply assumed she'd fail. The sermon gave them permission to revise their judgments without admitting they'd been cruel. It was imperfect forgiveness, incomplete acknowledgement, but it was movement. Eric Walker visited Rebecca privately on January 10th. Snow still covered the ground, but temperatures had moderated to merely cold rather than deadly. He carried building sketches he'd drawn plans for a new cabin that incorporated lessons from her dugout. He spread the papers on her floor. I want to build partially underground, 2 feet below grade stone foundation for thermal mass, thick earth-insulated walls. It combines traditional frame construction with your innovations. Rebecca studied the drawings with professional interest. The design was sound, showing that Eric had understood principles rather than just copying her specific implementation. This would work. You'd still need conventional heating, but far less than a fully above-ground structure. Eric's voice was quiet. I came to Dakota with $80 and big plans. Built my cabin for $380. It nearly killed me. You built for 27 and saved 14 lives. He met her eyes. I'm not asking you to marry me. I know you're 16 and I'm 24, but I want to court you properly, when you're ready, if you're willing. The offer represented something Rebecca hadn't allowed herself to consider, a future that included partnership rather than just survival. Eric had proven himself in ways that mattered. He'd admitted error. He'd accepted teaching from someone society said he should dismiss. He'd defended her against Jeffrey Lewis without being asked. Ask me again in a year. Rebecca's voice was careful, not rejecting, but not committing. If we both survive, and I still want the same things, then yes. If not, I'll tell you honestly. Eric accepted the conditional answer without complaint. He gathered his sketches and left, but something had shifted between them from mutual respect to acknowledged possibility. Spring arrived slowly, winter releasing its grip incrementally rather than all at once. March brought warming days interrupted by freezing nights. April delivered rain that turned snow to slush and exposed ground that hadn't seen sunlight in months. By May, green shoots pushed through dead grass, and the prairie remembered it was alive. 5 families built dugouts that spring using Rebecca's design as template, but adding individual modifications. Michael Anderson's version was larger, 12 feet by 20, to accommodate his family of 5. Kenneth Taylor's included a small glass window salvaged from his ruined cabin. Thomas Wright built exactly to Rebecca's specifications, trusting her judgment completely after his own had failed so catastrophically. Eric Walker's hybrid design became its own category, respected by both traditionalists and innovators. He employed Rebecca as consultant, paying her $50 for 3 weeks of guidance, the first money she'd earned since arriving in Dakota. The settlement's character began changing. Competition yielded partially to cooperation. Families shared resources more freely, understanding that everyone's survival benefited from collective knowledge rather than hoarded secrets. The change was imperfect and incomplete, but it was real. The settlement also needed a new name. Millwood had never fit well, there was no mill, and wood was scarce commodity. Informally, people started referring to the area as Rebecca's Stand. The name spread organically, appearing in letters and conversations until even the land office clerk began using it in official correspondence. "Where did you file your claim, Rebecca's Stand, couple miles south of the old Millwood site?" The renaming acknowledged what everyone now understood: a teenage girl had held her ground when every authority figure predicted her failure, and her stubborn survival had rewritten local assumptions about viable construction. Helen Moore's baby arrived on March 14th. She'd sent her brother to fetch Rebecca at the first contractions, and Rebecca had come immediately, bringing Shirley Allen because birth required experienced hands. The labor lasted 14 hours, conducted in Rebecca's dugout because it was warmer and safer than Helen's partially rebuilt cabin. Roger Moore paced outside in the cold barred from the birthing room by customs he didn't question. The baby boy emerged healthy and crying, pink-skinned and perfect. Helen wept while holding him, exhausted and relieved and grateful. She named him Roger Jr. after his father, but called him R.J. to distinguish them. "You were born in the same place that saved my life." Helen's voice was thick with emotion. "That means something. That connects you to this ground and this girl who knew how to listen to it." Rebecca cleaned the baby and wrapped him in cloth, while Shirley tended to Helen's immediate needs. The old woman worked with practiced efficiency, her hands sure despite their age. When everything was settled and Helen was nursing, Shirley sat back against the wall. "This makes me think of the hideaways during slavery. We had babies born underground while dogs hunted above. Most of those children didn't survive long enough to see sunlight. This one," she gestured at RJ, "he gets to grow up free in a country that's supposed to be free, born in shelter that saved lives instead of just hiding them." The weight of that history sat in the warm dugout, connecting past suffering to present survival in ways that couldn't be fully articulated but were deeply felt. On April 2nd, the settlement held a community gathering to formally acknowledge Shirley Allen's contributions. It was Michael Anderson's idea, proposed publicly and supported unanimously by families she'd helped save through her knowledge of earth shelters and herbal medicine. Michael stood before the assembled crowd. Mrs. Allen brought Rebecca the shovel that made all this possible. She taught construction techniques she learned hiding from slave hunters on the Underground Railroad. Her wisdom, passed from her grandmother, saved 14 lives. He extended his hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Allen, for everything." Shirley shook his hand, her expression unreadable. It was the first time in 8 years that white settlers in this community had publicly acknowledged her as someone whose knowledge mattered, whose experience carried value beyond servitude. The recognition was imperfect, still tinged with the paternalism of white people congratulating themselves for basic decency. But it was movement, acknowledgement, where there had been erasure. Thomas Wright added his voice. Mrs. Allen has more wisdom about survival than any manual I've read. She's taught me that experience outweighs theory and that we owe debts to people we've ignored for too long. The gathering ended with shared food and conversation. Shirley sat beside Rebecca, the two of them watching the community that had mocked them, now celebrating them. Shirley's voice was quiet. Don't let this make you soft. They're grateful now because they needed saving. Come next crisis, some of them will forget. Gratitude is seasonal. Character is what people show when they don't need you anymore. Rebecca absorbed the warning. Shirley was right. Human memory was short and fear-driven. Transformation didn't always last. But for now, change was happening, and that mattered even if it proved temporary. Rebecca lived in her dugout through 1892, 6 years total. She continued homesteading, proving up her claim after the required 5 years of residence and cultivation. The land was legally hers, purchased through persistence rather than money. Eric courted her properly through those years. He visited regularly, helped with heavy labor. She couldn't manage. Alone respected her boundaries completely. He built his hybrid cabin on his own claim and proved it worked through 2 winters of testing. On April 3, 1888, Rebecca turned 18. Eric proposed that evening with a ring he'd made himself from silver he'd saved for months. The design was simple, a plain band with no stone, just careful craftsmanship. I'm asking now because you told me to ask in a year. It's been 2. His voice carried hope and uncertainty. In equal measure, I love you. I respect what you built and who you are. Will you marry me? Rebecca studied the ring, the man, the offer. Eric had proven himself through action rather than words. He'd learned from her without resentment. He'd defended her without expecting gratitude. He'd waited without pressure. Yes, but I'm keeping my name, Rebecca Clark, not Rebecca Walker. I built this myself, and I'm not erasing that. Eric's smile was genuine. I wouldn't ask you to. I fell in love with Rebecca Clark. That's who I want to marry. They wed quietly in April 1889 with Shirley Allen and Helen Moore as witnesses. No elaborate ceremony, no public celebration, just 4 people standing in the church while Thomas Wright conducted a service stripped of his earlier certainty and filled instead with humble prayer. Eric and Rebecca built a new cabin together 100 yards from her original dugout. The design combined his carpentry skills with her thermal principles, partially underground stone foundation, thick earth berms against walls, sod-integrated roofing. The structure cost $420, but heated efficiently on minimal fuel. They preserved the original dugout intact, converting it to root cellar. The stable temperature holding steady between 55 and 60 degrees year-round made it perfect for food storage. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, apples, preserved meats, everything kept without spoilage in the earth's patient embrace. Their first child, Catherine, was born in 1890. The baby spent her vulnerable first winter in the original dugout while Rebecca and Eric worked in the cabin above. The arrangement became pattern for all four children: Catherine Michael, born 1892, Thomas in 1895, Sarah in 1898. Each infant's first months happened underground, protected by the same earth that had sheltered their mother through her first Dakota winter. Rebecca would carry them down daily nursing in the consistent warmth, then return them to the cabin when weather permitted. Rebecca's reputation expanded beyond local settlement. By 1895, newspapers in Bismarck ran articles about the teenage homesteader who'd survived by building underground. Reporters traveled from 3 states to interview her, to photograph the famous dugout, to write stories that framed her as curiosity rather than innovator. She tolerated the attention without encouraging it. The articles helped in one way: they brought students. Young homesteaders, particularly women, sought her out for consultation on earth shelter construction. She taught freely, sharing techniques her grandfather had recorded and methods she'd developed through trial. By 1900, at age 30, Rebecca had become the settlement's unofficial expert on thermal mass construction and sustainable building. She'd published a small pamphlet in 1905, 20 pages, self-printed, distributed free to anyone who asked. The title was practical rather than poetic: Thermal Mass Construction for the Common Homesteader. The pamphlet explained principles in accessible language, included diagrams, provided material lists, and cost estimates. It acknowledged her grandfather's Irish earth house tradition while documenting her specific Dakota adaptations. Copies circulated through homesteading communities across the northern plains. Eric died in 1928 at age 65, his heart giving out while he split wood for winter. Rebecca found him beside the woodpile, axe still in hand, his face peaceful. They'd had 39 years together, built a successful homestead, raised 4 children to adulthood, and created something that endured. Rebecca continued alone. At 60, she was still robust, still capable of the physical labor homesteading required. She maintained the cabin, worked the garden, consulted with settlers who sought her expertise. She died January 12, 1932, at age 62. Pneumonia contracted during an unusually harsh cold snap. Her daughter, Catherine, found her in the cabin wrapped in the same wool blanket she'd carried from Chicago 46 years earlier. The funeral on January 15th drew over 400 people from 3 states. Everyone had a story. Brandon Anderson, now 54, and farming his father's expanded acreage, credited Rebecca with his life, saved twice, once from illness and once from blizzard. Roger Moore Jr., born in Rebecca's dugout, brought his own children to pay respects to the woman his mother had trusted more than doctors. Shirley Allen's grandchildren attended, representing a woman who died in 1910 at 92. They carried forward her stories about earth shelters and survival, about 2 outcasts who'd built friendship from shared rejection. 12 families living in earth shelters Rebecca had designed came to honor their teacher. Their homes worked, their children thrived, their heating costs remained minimal, while conventional houses burned money as fast as firewood. The headstone commissioned by her children carried the inscription Eric had requested, before his death. Rebecca Clark Walker, 1870 to 1932. She built her foundation in the dirt. She lived beneath the open sky. She proved humble spirit provides more warmth than arrogant heart. Mother, teacher, survivor, savior. The original dugout still exists. 142 years after construction, it sits at the center of a county historical museum preserved exactly as Rebecca left it in 1892. The sod roof has been stabilized with modern materials, but the structure itself remains unchanged. On a freezing January afternoon, visitors can enter and feel the temperature difference immediately. Outside might register 10 degrees above zero. Inside holds at 54 degrees without any heating system active. The Earth continues its work maintaining stability, keeping its ancient promise. The museum placard explains the physics in language Rebecca would recognize. At 6 feet below grade, soil temperature remains constant year-round, unaffected by surface conditions. This shelter, built for $27 by a 16-year-old girl, saved 14 lives during the blizzard of 1886, while structures costing hundreds of dollars failed catastrophically. Modern sustainable building movements have rediscovered Rebecca's principles. Earthships, passive solar design, geothermal heating all draw on the same fundamental understanding she learned from her grandfather's journal. The cutting edge is often the most primitive, forgotten wisdom, reclaimed by people desperate enough to look beyond conventional solutions. How often do we dismiss people too quickly? Rebecca Clark was 16, female, poor, and alone, everything society measured as deficit. She was thrown away like garbage bet, against predicted to die within weeks. Yet she survived and saved others, specifically because she refused to accept conventional wisdom as the only wisdom. How many Rebecca Clarks exist right now being ignored because they're too young, too different, too poor, or too unconventional? How many solutions to our biggest problems are being dismissed because they come from the wrong people? What if the answer to homelessness, climate change, or poverty is already out there, spoken by someone nobody's listening to? The question isn't rhetorical. It's immediate and urgent. Somewhere right now, a person with knowledge gained from poverty or marginalization or desperate necessity is being ignored because they don't fit the profile of expert. Their solutions are dismissed because they violate assumptions held by people who've never had to choose between pride and survival. Rebecca's story teaches that survival wisdom often comes from the people the powerful try to throw away. The ground protects its children when humans won't, and sometimes those children grow up knowing things the comfortable will never learn. Here's the real question for you. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever built something others said was impossible? Maybe you're facing that right now. People telling you you can't, you won't, you're too young, too poor, too different, too late. What's your sod house? What are you building that others don't understand yet? Because Rebecca's story isn't just history. It's happening today, wherever someone refuses to quit despite the odds. Drop your story in the comments. You might inspire someone who desperately needs to hear that persistence matters more than permission. That innovation comes from necessity, that the people betting against you don't determine your outcome. Someone out there needs to know they're not alone in digging their foundation while others mock them for it. Someone needs evidence that holding your ground when everyone predicts your collapse isn't foolish. It's the only way anything worthwhile gets built. Rebecca Clark stood on empty Dakota prairie in September 1886 with a knife and $200 and the certainty that she would either build survival or die trying. She chose digging downward when everyone said, "Build up." She chose soil over timber, thermal mass over iron stoves, grandfather's wisdom over expert manuals. She built her foundation in the dirt, and when the blizzard came, when nature's impartial judgment tested every structure equally, her $27 earth shelter outperformed mansions costing 40 times more. The lesson isn't that expensive things don't work. It's that survival belongs to people who understand their specific context deeply enough to choose appropriate solutions rather than conventional ones. Rebecca survived because she listened to the ground instead of the crowd, because she trusted experience over authority, because she refused to die just because others expected her to. Thank you for remembering her. Thank you for keeping these voices alive. May your own homestead, however you build it, always keep the frost at bay. And may you never forget sometimes the most powerful response to a world that rejects you is to dig a little deeper, build something far sturdier, and let your quiet, undeniable results drown out 1,000 critics. The earth always keeps its promises. The question is whether we're humble enough to learn its language before winter comes.